Welcome. Good morning and welcome to the final presentation in our lecture series. We are very excited to invite you to the Colloquium. This Colloquium is sponsored by the Department of Interpretation and Translation, as well as the Center for Advancement of Interpretation and Translation Research. All presentations are archived in our webcast for your view at a later time at no charge. We want to thank our two interpreters, Diana Markle, as well as L'Oreal Dutton, who will be interpreting for the Colloquium presentation this morning. When Pamela has completed her presentation, we invite you all to a lunch at the second floor of the cafeteria to participate in a dialogue with Pamela Collins. I would like to now introduce Dr. Brenda Nicodemus to say a few words about the Colloquium. Thank you, Dr. Cagle, and again, welcome to our audience. I want to say a few words about the Colloquium. The lecture series is comprised of 4 lectures by a variety of scholars. And we also invite scholars from who are our visiting audiences. This is our last speaker, Pamela Collins, who's a member of our faculty and is here to share with you her dissertation research about the scheduling of ASL English interpreters, which I believe you will find fascinating. The structure of today will start with Pamela's presentation. After that, we will invite Dr. Emily Shaw as a respondent to initiate some discussion with Pamela. When that response is open, we will then open it up for audience questions and comments. Please at that point come to the front of the stage in order to ask your question. We will wrap up at about 11:30. And as Dr. Cagle said, you can then join us at the second floor of the cafeteria for a reception in which we can celebrate Pam together. One thing to note is that you can earn continuing education units for today. If you would like to benefit from CEUs, please see Mark Holmes. Mark, raise your hand. At the conclusion of this talk, you will need to sign a CEU form. Thank you to Mark for providing CEUs. I would like to now invite back Dr. Keith Cagle to introduce our speaker. We are thrilled to have Pamela Collins come to present this morning. A little bit about her background. She was born in Columbia, Maryland, which is a city not far away from DC. She then moved to Atlanta, Georgia, where she started learning ASL at the age of 25 from the deaf community in Atlanta. She became part of that community and over the years traversed the career ladder. She has been full-time staff at Gallaudet Interpreting Service, and we notice many GIS staff members in the audience, former colleagues of Pamela's. Welcome. Pamela then became a full-time professor in the Department of Interpretation and Translation last fall, and we are thrilled to welcome her to our faculty. She's also a doctoral student in our program and plans to give her defense soon, which is something that we are all looking forward to. She has presented often internationally and nationally. Has been involved with PCRID, NAOB, DC, and DOIT's support of students of color. She's actively involved in the interpreting community. Pamela's mother is also in attendance. Her name is Jackie Cotton. Welcome. As a mother, she is proud of her daughter presenting today. To share a little bit about Pamela's family, Pamela has a grandmother in New York City who is with North Carolina, who is over 100. We are again thrilled to welcome Pamela Collins as our presenter this morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So hello, I'm so excited to be here. And first, well, let me wait for Dr. Cagle to take a seat. Before I go on, I absolutely want to thank you for such a warm introduction and a welcome to me. Thank you, Keith. And Dr. Nicodemus, thank you also for being here and giving me this honor and inviting me to present today. So hello, everyone. Thank you. There's so many familiar faces out there in the audience, those who are my supporters who love me, and I'm thrilled and inspired that you're all here. But I don't want us to be in this room, actually. This is a very formal room. I want us to act as if we're in my living room, and we're just going to have a conversation and get a chance to chat. But again, thank you all for coming. And I'm here just to share some of the thinking that I've been doing over the last 18 years. From the moment I took on interpreting, there were situations that baffled me. There were situations that stopped me and paused me to think about why. And that was continuous along my journey as an interpreter. And so I want to invite you into that journey and understand some of the things that I began to think about. And then 4 years ago, actually started to thinking about more seriously, more academically, and decided to do more of an exploration. It doesn't just come from me. Obviously, I wanted to have an approach. I didn't want just my personality and my opinions in this. I wanted to do a research explanation into this phenomenon. So again, thank you for coming, and welcome to my journey. So what I'm talking about and some of these questions that arose for me have to do with how interpreters are scheduled. I was being scheduled. I was put on certain jobs, and it raised questions for me. There were moments I was very baffled. And those have stayed with me and continued on. And so I'm going to invite you into a parable, thinking of this as a village. It's a beautiful sunny day, and there's a river that goes through this town with a bridge over the river. And there's a woman who's gone out for a walk, and she's walking along the river. She looks over and she notices a baby floating down the river. She immediately jumps in to rescue the baby and takes it out. And then the next thing, a second baby comes floating down the river. And then another one, and another. And at some point, it's no longer just an individual baby, but it's the babies are coming 2 by 2 and 3 by 3. And she's yelling to people in the town, I need your help, come, there's these babies, they're all floating down the river. And so people in the town come running and start helping to take the babies out. And it dawns on her that there's just too many babies. So she pauses, and then she gets out of the river. And people there are saying, what are you doing? There are more babies. But she said, no, there's just too many babies. I'm going to start walking upstream. I need to figure out, why are the babies in the river? How are they getting there? So that's who I am. I am that woman. And I want to understand scheduling of interpreters. So I'm walking upstream to figure out, not just from my perspective, but from schedulers' perspectives, from deaf consumers, from interpreters, and managers. What is it that throughout my career has given me pause or gotten me to wonder or been confused? So that's what I'm doing. And I'm inviting all of you to come with me right now. Let's go upstream. So as we begin to look at scheduling, my question started with, how did something happen? I have personal experiences, and I would be thinking, how did this happen? Why am I there? Well, here's an example of something that happened on the world stage that I'm sure many of you wondered, how did this event happen? I'm sure you wondered that. And then you can map it onto your own experiences. Well, instead of making assumptions about why something like this happens, and I'll just break it down to the questions that I had. Why me? Why now? So many questions come to mind. So to get to some of those answers, let me give you this example. If I asked you, how does a vacuum cleaner work? I'm pretty sure you'd say to me that it sucks up the dirt. I mean, all of us have that understanding. You vacuum, and the dirt will get sucked up, right? But if you really want to understand the how, what's happening inside that vacuum cleaner, you'd have to take it apart, open it up, and take a look at some of the springs or the motor or the pieces that are in there, the wires, whatever the specific parts are. That would give you a better understanding of how this is happening. So the same thing happens with scheduling. How does it actually happen? We think we understand it. We have a general understanding, just like we have a general understanding of a vacuum cleaner. But it's taking that extra time, looking on a deeper level, taking it apart. That was my goal. So I started out wanting to understand, how does scheduling happen? When I first joined the deaf community, my understanding was to make sure that I was clear, people were understanding me, that I matched whatever situation I was going to. There were lots of things that I had learned about that. But then as I began interpreting, that wasn't the experience that I had all of the time. Sometimes, but most of the time, there was someone else that would assign me to a particular job. And I would ask for certain questions, but often I wouldn't get some of those answers before I'd get to the job. So that was my experience, and I wanted to start understanding from others' experience what was happening to them. I wanted to pull others into the conversation and learn from them so that we could then look at this whole process of actually scheduling interpreters. So originally, when scheduling was happening for interpreters, I mean back in the 60s, I can remember being asked by individual deaf people, Pam, are you available to come do something for me? You know, if it was a doctor's appointment on Thursday at 2 o'clock, I would be individually asked by a person. And that's how I got on the job. It was a smaller community. People knew each other. People knew the skills that I brought. And so I was asked for who I was. There wasn't any question about it. And it's similar to what we used to have with more mom and pop retail. You'd walk in, you'd talk to the people there, you knew them on an individual basis. But what we have now is not so much mom and pop. We have big box stores like Walmart, similar with scheduling interpreters. We don't often know the people, we just get assigned to jobs. So that what occurred with retail is similar to what happened within the scheduling process. I wanted to understand more what was happening and how did that happen now. When a request is made and then an interpreter gets placed on a job, in that gap right in there, what's actually happening? So a request goes in for interpreting services, and then an interpreter is assigned to a job. But there's a lot of things that are going on. And my goal was to shine the light on what's occurring. So coming from interpreters, there is an occurring, what they think is happening. But then there's also others who are involved, schedulers, and they have a view of what's occurring. But what is actually there? So if we look back, there was more of a connection, maybe between direct communication between the consumer and the interpreters. Similar to that mom and pop situation I was talking about if you were going to the doctor. It's not as if we want to go back to that. That really didn't have everything that was needed. But there were certain aspects of it that were really important. People knew each other. People had, deciding, is this the interpreter that I can work with, or the interpreter is this client or that person that I work with? And sometimes now, that's not what's happening with scheduling. Are the actual schedulers trained to even look at it that way? So those are some of the questions that started appearing in this. So I knew what I wanted to look at, but I had to figure out what type of tool I wanted to use for the research. And I came upon institutional ethnography, which I'm going to refer to as IE. So Dorothy Smith, and there were others involved, actually originated this. And they created it as a frame to not only look at participants involved with some everyday experience. So they were asking participants, and from those conversations, what was emerging? Certain policies and rules people were following. There were text examples, things that were written in emails. But hearing the stories from participants, looking at the text, understanding all that, it actually tied it into some larger systemic influences, that it was all connected. So in interpreting, that's access, and there's other things I'm going to continue on from my findings. But that's why I chose this. It was a very flexible tool. And when you use institutional ethnography, you start from the researcher's perspective and standpoint. So for me, I'm an interpreter. So I began with asking other interpreters. I wanted to hear from them what were their experiences. And from those conversations, I would move on potentially to talking with others. So I have categories listed up here. One says text. I don't mean pager and texting. It's actually things that are documented, whether it's handbooks, policies, things like this, or what are all included under that category of text. So I did interviews. There were texts that I used. I showed up and did some observations. I watched scheduling processes. When an event needed to be scheduled, what was it they were doing? And I started taking field notes in what I was observing. And then I actually conducted some focus groups where I had 2 or 3 questions that I would pose to the groups, whether they were groups of interpreters, consumers, but these various groups. And then we would get involved with a discussion. And I would collect all of the responses. So thinking back to the town and the river and all of the townspeople coming, I couldn't understand the other people's experiences. That's their view. I only have mine. As a researcher, I have mine. Now, everyone else's perspective is equally as important as mine, but I can't speak to that. If I wanted to understand that, I would have to go and ask to get their standpoint. And that's the crux of institutional ethnography, is to start from my own standpoint and then engage with others. So I conducted interviews, and from what I gained from those interviews, other things organically came up. So I had an interview, and if managers were mentioned or deaf consumers were mentioned, Then I would start and go interviewing others in those categories. I didn't create the categories. This is what emerged from the conversations I had. So I interviewed members from each of these groups. And during that, I noticed patterns of phases that were happening. So I don't have everything in detail of what happens in each of these, but as I began to shine the light by doing these interviews, these were the patterns that emerged. So obviously, before the request, there's something that's going on, even that gets you to people making the request. And once there's a request, there's a lot of things that happen. And then when interpreters are providing service, even afterwards, of things that are happening. But these are the patterns that emerge for me and what I'm now calling the life cycle of interpreting, LCS, the life cycle of scheduling, and that's what I'm focusing on. But each of these, someone could take any phase and then do some more research and have their own doctoral study on any one of these segments. I'm looking at the entire process, this life cycle, and that's what my study is about. And again, I'm calling this LCS.
What you see on the slide is not a theme, but these were the realities that emerged from each participant's contribution. These are not all of the patterns that emerged, but when scheduling happened, somebody might remember, if you remember back to my situation where somebody told me that I was the best fit for a particular job, what and how were those connections made? How did society have influences on the end assignment of an interpreter to a request? My aim is to shine the light on those influences. Again, these are not my words. These are findings from interpreters' perspectives. This interpreter noticed the difference in the original scheduling where a consumer would directly ask an interpreter to fill a job, and the difference between that and the corporatization of the interpreting business. Interpreters are trained to follow a code of professional conduct. Do no harm. But schedulers are not familiar with the CPC. One of the schedulers told me that the CPC was something that an interpreter had to deal with, not the schedulers, that they didn't have their own way of making decisions. And what I was trying to do was shine the light, lean into how they made their decisions. Another viewpoint comes from managers, which is a different viewpoint than the interpreter, wondering if they are the best person from the job, and even divergent from a scheduler's perspective about the efficiency of filling a job. A manager is looking at the overall business aspect of interpreting. And you'll see that each of these viewpoints is contradictory. Deaf people are not involved in that process of the request. The staff of a staff person being assigned or a contractor being assigned. They may be involved in the initial request process, but not involved in the process between that request going to a scheduler and an interpreter being assigned. This interpreter talks about special requests. Think back to the 1960s, when an interpreter would be directly asked by a deaf person to fill their request, which has now been replaced with other processes that I will talk about more later. Interpreters felt the change, but weren't involved with the decision-making process of how this change was made and where these special requests were coming from. As interpreters, we were used to being specially asked by a deaf person to fill a job, but the process of special requesting from a scheduler's perspective was very different. Understand, this is not a criticism of people. People are part of systems. We're simply shining a light on what happened. The point of my research is not to criticize, but to simply shine a light on the process, to make it accessible for us to understand what is going on in interpreter scheduling. From a scheduling perspective, X number of jobs need to be filled, and Y number of interpreters are available. Scheduling often feels pressure from above to get those jobs filled efficiently. This just goes to show, this does not mean that people don't value their worth, but often they're operating under a time constraint. And so what is going on because of that time constraint is something I needed to explore, because it's not clear. You have to know here that it is also very possible that the interpreter turned down the job because they had a conflict. So we don't know the exact story of what went on behind the scenes, but this is an alternate perspective on what happened. We don't know that later the interpreter told that deaf person that they were available during the time. But often we see interpreters saying that they were available but were never asked. Remember, we saw that managers also need to make decisions about timing, about the business aspect of interpreting, and all of those scenarios come into play. From many of the comments that were said, patterns emerged about race. And wondering why particular policies that weren't written down anywhere, led to certain decisions being made. The conclusion was that societal racism was having a direct effect on how interpreters were being scheduled. Schedulers were making a decision about what consumers wanted, but did they ever ask if the deaf participants would rather have a skin match without skill? Those were questions that never came up. What happens when somebody assumes that the audience wants an interpreter who looks like them? Once scheduling exhausted all of the possibilities, if it happened here at Gallaudet, certain interpreters would be asked first. And if they were not available, another interpreter may be brought in to fill that job. Like Falami, Candace, Tiffany, Kathy. And then if none of those people were available, somebody else would be brought in to fill the request. Because of participant contributions, I started to lean in to understand policies, requests that were having a direct impact on the scheduling process. Texts as well as institutional discourse. Arises in all of these phases. Like I said, each phase could be its own dissertation because there is so much that shows up in each one of those phases of scheduling interpreters. With each conversation, with each policy, with each rule, structures were uncovered. The influence of capitalism, the goal of access, larger social structures that were directly impacting the rules and policies that were leading to the decisions people made on a daily basis. This study is situated in the larger context of access. Access as defined by the ADA. But we have not looked at what we are doing to get to the place of providing access. Houston, we've got a problem. We continue to respond to businesses, people, requests in our growing profession. We know that this is important, and we're all here because we think it's important. We often go about our daily lives and our activities that don't lead to access. But access is the primary goal of providing interpreting. That happens because we don't step back and shine a light on what it is we're actually doing. In order to make a change, we first need to understand the processes and structures that lead to these decisions being made. I showed you a few quotes from interpreters and schedulers. And why controversies exist is because we don't do a good job of understanding what other stakeholders do. And what does it mean to be the best fit? We don't define what we mean. And each of us comes into the scheduling process with different views. Often you see job announcements for schedulers say things like, good with people, can manage Excel, can multitask. But often the job descriptions say nothing about making decisions about the interpreting task or having any knowledge of the code of professional conduct. Furthermore, surprise, surprise, this is nothing new. Interpreting has become corporatized. We're part of a big business. Think about when you go grocery shopping. You don't even get to interact with a cashier anymore. You're often your own cashier. Think about interacting with a business. Often you get a phone tree. Click 1 for X, Y, and Z. In the end, you never even get a live person. As an interpreting profession, we have failed to acknowledge that fact. Truly, we need to make a change. We can't stop this process, but we need to shine the light on why we're not getting to the end goal of access. I want to take you full circle. Come back to the town with me. You are those townspeople. You are seeing the babies in the water, and I am calling those babies access. I've shared with you what I see from my point of view, but from each perspective, managers, schedulers, deaf consumers, we need everyone's view in order to understand the bigger picture. My research is not enough. We need more. Remember, the end goal is access, and it's not occurring. Often we feel this sense of mistrust, that there is no access is not happening, and I suggest that we take a step back and look at why. Let's reframe the dialogue. This is my village. Pamela, thank you so much. This is such an important comment. Often it's important for us to do what we did in The Wizard of Oz, to look behind the curtain, to understand who is the man behind the curtain. Thank you for this groundbreaking work. It is very much appreciated. I would like to now introduce Dr. Emily Shaw as respondent to offer her thoughts and comments on your presentation. Honestly, I feel lucky because I have direct access to our presenter, and I'm sorry none of you have this opportunity that I do. Pamela, I am thrilled to see your work. I have many thoughts. One directly about the parable of the stream. Often as interpreters, we're on the front line. And many of you are working in government agencies, sitting on call. We often wonder who's in charge, who's making the decisions. They might assume that if they hire a staff interpreter, that person will take care of all of the problems. Now, from an EEO person's perspective, they may say, it's not in the policy that the deaf person has the right to request a certain interpreter. I'm just following the policy. As long as they have an interpreter, that's fine. For us as interpreters, this is maddening. And so this work is uniquely important. You know this already. I'm just coming up to second what you've already said. Can you explain a little bit more of institutional ethnography as an approach? Why did you start with your view or the view of interpreters instead of starting with the deaf consumer?
Sure. And so just looking at institutional ethnography, the experience I have is mine. I don't have the experience of a deaf consumer. I mean, absolutely, I can see from my view what I think is happening, but I don't own that experience. So a requirement for institutional ethnography is that the researcher starts from where their experience comes from, their standpoint. And so I can talk to other interpreters. And again, based on what I'm learning from the contributions they're making, that will then guide me to who else I might want to talk to. And it, for me, turn into managers and schedulers, and deaf consumers. But I need to start from my everyday experience and begin to unpack that first.
And that experience and those contributions then guide you to make the connections to other participants, meaning that other participants' perspectives are within your research.
Yes. So to get a full view of everything, you have to start by asking others, and from their perspective, that might lead me. What is another individual's perspective, their daily experience? So a deaf consumer, what are they experiencing? So if they were to do research, they would start from their own perspective. So someone is saying, I want this particular interpreter. They might ask that of the agency. The process occurs, whatever's happening in the agency, they ask for Jen, and Kim shows up on the assignment. How did that happen? The deaf consumer is saying, wait a second, I asked for a particular interpreter who knows me, knows the content area, and then I show up on the job and I get someone who has no background. Well, how did that happen? That's the everyday experience coming from a deaf consumer. And what is that? For mine, I look at it from my perspective as an interpreter. Schedulers have theirs. So it's all of us working in concert to unpack this, as opposed to just blaming others, assuming we know what's going on. We really don't. Not until we start exploring it together. And then there's larger society things impacting this whole process too.
It's an interesting idea to start from your agency as an individual within a set systemic structure. And how do we have agency within that system? Often as interpreters, we see the problems. But how do we shift from what is in our realm of control? Can you speak to that?
I say we do that by just shining a light on all of it together. We're all stakeholders, and it's understanding and looking at it together. Not just looking at it from scheduling, not just looking at it from any of the other participant groups, but really uncovering all of it. So we hear from so many that this is important. You know, we need to get rid of a particular part. We need to maybe hire all deaf people and they'll become the schedulers and then scheduling will work. No, actually what institutional ethnography says, look at all of it. Understand it first. Pull it apart. Shine that light on it. You can't really make change. First you have to understand what's happening. How is it happening? So each and every one of us here can go back to agencies we work with, to scheduling groups and say, let's look at it. what are we doing? What are all these parts that come together that affect the actual scheduling? So it's engaging with all of the stakeholders and getting everyone's view.
Thank you. And I know that that's difficult. But what's great about your approach is that you interview people to understand their experience, but you also are looking at policies. Because of course the policies that are established impact an individual's agency. And often decisions are made based on policy.
Absolutely. Individual views, policies, the whole systemic nature of it, all of it work in concert.
I wanted to go back to your idea of mom and pop store as a nostalgic view. Often we have that nostalgia of the good old days, that everybody in the community knew everybody else. Now we can't think that, of course, looking back everything is rosy, because there were problems. That mandate that deaf people have access is a good thing. Having more interpreters is a good thing. But we now have to look at the provision of interpreters and how we can expand the number of interpreters to meet the supply, or to meet the demand within DC, but still keeping that direct aspect of the request being made, instead of inviting in a middleman. Can you speak to that experience?
So let's back up and think about the good old days, the nostalgia you talked about. And I would say that's right. We can't go back and say everything was perfect then. No. We can go back to that and we say now there's more professional standards and there's guidelines that have come out of that might have not all originally been there. But as each new step has come along the way, maybe we've forgotten about some of the stakeholders, the consumers. So we've grown, it's become more corporatized. But what were some of the things that were really important initially? So there's strengths now. It's almost as if like we can't just take people who drove on country roads and put them on a highway. There may be a car crash. It's recognizing the shifts and changes. For me, it's been 18 years. We can't expect everyone to just see from my point of view now or what's happening in this new way of scheduling. But potential approaches and ways to make some changes. And I'm an interpreter, so that's why I'm pulling out the interpreting. But as a group, looking at what's happening in real time, politics and all the systemic changes, but looking at what's there, can we create ways I mean, if you have a list of names of interpreters and a deaf person makes a direct request, they have the contract and they say, I want this particular interpreter. They have their own blue book or their black book. They have the group of interpreters they're more comfortable to working with, right? I know some of them, but I don't know others. Where does that idea of previously the way we scheduled, of people getting their preference, how does that fit in this larger view of how we interpret and how we schedule interpreters now? So shining a light on why some processes have changed, what we don't want to lose, helps us all.
So focusing on the scheduling aspect is key. I will stop now and turn it over to the audience.
And I do want to add something else, if you don't mind. I know now currently in interpreter training programs, they welcome in students. If you graduate from our program, you're ready to go as a full-fledged interpreter. It could work that way. But why isn't there a track or courses that talk about scheduling? And why don't we bring students in? And some students might not go on to become an interpreter, but as they begin, maybe they see and recognize scheduling is a field that they want to get into, that they actually receive training in what scheduling is and how and why. Right now, we take schedulers. Typically, they have no background in this whole process. Now, often spoken language agencies, which have no connection to the deaf community, are having the contracts to schedule interpreters. Or even government agencies are scheduling sign language interpreters. So is a deaf consumer, has to go with the lowest bid, the way they purchase and procurement in other ways, the lowest bidder as an agency? That's what's happening. And there's no real understanding, and yet deaf people are getting services based on the lowest bid.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. We appreciate your comments and perspectives. First off, this is a full house. I see people from so many different positions, students who may graduate and face those scheduling conundrums. Some of you in this room are schedulers, and some are deaf consumers who experience this distance effect. We now are going to open it up to the audience for questions and comments to our speaker. If you have a question or comment, please come to the front. This is great. Can I hug you? Sorry, my hands are a little bit wet. I'm just I'm sweating because I'm so inspired by your presentation. Thank you again. Based on my experience as a new interpreter within the DC area, I often feel that different freelance agencies are always asking me to go interpret at this job or another. But as an interpreter, I want to go where my skills are of best use. What advice would you provide for a new interpreter who is still developing themselves as a professional? How do I manage where I go and where I'm scheduled?
Great, and that's really an important question. I don't have all of the answers. As again, I say I have my experience, and I've worked for many years, but this has been my journey, my experiences. So I start within my own group, other interpreters, and we have a similar goal. Maybe we work in the same place. For me, it was an agency, and working in that agency, I started making connections and bonds with others who were doing the same work. We were a group of interpreters. Our goal was to become certified, and we were going to be on that journey together. Form these networks for yourself. Get involved with them. This is my community. I actually was part of instituting TrueBiz. Other members who are here today, please stand up and be recognized. You're in the audience. This is my group. So before I really jumped in and took assignments, also I got involved with the deaf community. I started asking questions. And let me back up. I know there are businesses out there and agencies, they want to fill the job. And that's fine, and they can do that. But for me as an individual, and they'll tell me I'll be fine on a particular job, but I had my own thought, and I would check in maybe with Falami or another. What do you think? Kathy? Candace? Is this a job that I'm ready to do? What do you think? And that was the first part. I needed to build a more formal way to approach this. I couldn't just rely on myself. It's almost like thinking about Swiss cheese. There's a lot of holes in Swiss cheese, right? So how am I going to fill in those holes? So I have to figure out how to do that and how I'm going to build my network and my skills.
Thank you again. I need another hug. I'm Candace Barnes. Wow. I have no words because there are no words. One of the things that struck me the most today is the village that came out in support of this.
Oh,
that says it all.
I noticed. I absolutely took note.
That in of itself is a testimony to the importance of this work and to who you are as a professional, as a person, as my colleague, my advisor, my mentor, my friend. And the list goes on. I don't have any questions. I'm just coming in here as like a mom to say, amazing, hats off, and congratulations. Stop making me cry.
I told you I'm not going to mention any one in particular because there's too many people. But I have to say, there was one person who said, who would always be giving me advice, and that the point is that we really have to continue supporting each other.
I'm Alec. I'm now a student senior, and will soon be graduating. I'm wondering about the unique situations of a deaf interpreter working within the deaf community. How do you figure out? Often I get strange agencies contacting me as an interpreter. How do you handle that process?
So this approach that I took of looking at what the how, it also applies to CDI, tactile interpreting, all of it, because we're talking about scheduling. And so I would say to you, if you're going to do more research, what is your experience? And you start with institutional ethnography, getting in this conversation from your own experience and talking with others. Bring that into this body of research and knowledge so that we continue on with this exploration. And from that, we'll be able to make places of change. We need to look at it first. It's going to help us look at all of it. When we started in the old days, we need to include that, and it's really become more complex now. So continue that. Keep sharing your experience. Keep sharing your ideas, things that impact you daily, and that's going to help move us in the right direction for change.
Thank you. First of all, your talk was inspiring. Thank you for the research that you've done. And as Candace had said, thank you for the mentor and all of the other roles that you have played in my life. You mentioned the how, and I know that you've said it. It's very important to shine a light on what is going on now. But may I ask, what is your future vision? What do you want to see happen? Often interpreters work in isolation. We work alone, and we don't necessarily have the community support that we used to have. We don't have the opportunity to gather and talk about our work. I've often heard interpreters say that I'm isolated and I don't know where to go for support. Do you envision this conversation to be situated within Gallaudet, in RID? How can we, RIT? Oh, maybe not.
So what I would say is each of us bring our own experience, and it is when we come together and have conversations, to remember to involve everyone. Again, those different categories of consumers, managers, participants. We can have town hall meetings. That's a place to start. And it's sharing everyday experiences. Instead of just assuming, like I assume I know what a deaf person wants or their experience, or I assume I know why the schedules are doing something. We can't just assume it. We really have to engage and understand this. Not on Facebook. I'm not talking about engaging through social media in this conversation. I'm talking about really coming together in face-to-face interactions. We have Dr. Risa Shaw here. She has things coming together, discussing it unpacking it, finding out what's emerging in some of these patterns. That's what we need to do.
I know that you have to finish your defense, but later, as when you get your doctorate, I hope that we will be there.
Right, we're all in this complex phenomenon. It's not only me, right? And so I am a black interpreter, and then there are the whole view from different other people who are also, so it can't just bring out one person's view. We need to be in this conversation together.
I have to say I'm proud of you. Hillary and I had a similar question, and so I won't repeat it. But I think that it is so important that we create a dialogue like this quickly. Something like a town hall to keep this conversation going. And I do think that this conversation could have a place in RID. Yes, RID is our professional organization. And I think that they do need to be included in the conversation. Somehow we need to invite them into the dialogue. But yes, it is also for us to do too.
So I go back to thinking about True Biz, the group that I was involved with setting up. And that was a group maybe setting up a town hall with the topic having to do with scheduling. And then how is race impact or impacted by that? A lot of that is there. Maybe picking 4 topics, some questions, inviting people to come, stakeholders, but having a town hall. So we've discussed this amongst ourselves. You know, we're out to change the world. But we can't do it alone as True Biz, but we have definitely had these conversations. We cannot resolve everything. But another idea is a way to start, I think. And we can then bring this conversation and show our ideas, the conversations that we want to have.
I think that we should bring RID to the table now so that they are even part of the stakeholder group and we can all process this together.
I agree.
Pam, I love you. Thank you. I feel that it's not often we get to watch a dissertation defense before it's actually defended.
Don't get me started.
I'm looking forward to your official defense, and I'm sure it will be slightly different than what you shared today. I have a short story which will lead into my question. And I think that my question is very similar to what MJ shared. When I lived in Texas many years ago, I was newly certified under the Texas certification system, and I considered myself a baby interpreter. I contracted with an agency after passing their screening. And the first time I was contacted by a scheduler to offer me a job, they asked me to go to the emergency room. And of course, my answer was no. And I felt that I stood strongly my ground. I said, this is my first job with the agency. I'm a newly certified interpreter, and this is not my place. I was told by the scheduler if I was not willing to accept this job, the opportunities to take any job at that agency would be diminished. I still said no. But as a new interpreter, that scared me. I thought, what if I turn down several jobs? Does that mean that I will miss out on future opportunities? Of course, now I teach interpreting, and I share that story with my students. I think it's so important that we emphasize that new interpreters need to stand up for themselves to protect not only themselves, but the consumers involved in their work. Can you share what, if anything, your participants said about novel interpreters? Because we often now look at the gap from school to work or from graduation to certification. What have your participants said, if anything, about scheduling novice interpreters?
They did talk about that, being nervous to turn down jobs. But if they were following what they believed and what they had been taught, which would have been to say no, not being the best fit, they were definitely concerned with what you just mentioned. Will that impact future work and future opportunities? So many novice interpreters ended up accepting jobs when maybe they weren't ready for it. And then they're impacting deaf consumers who aren't getting a clear message, and that's the repeated cycle. So I agree exactly what you're bringing up now, that point. And this is such an important point for interpreter training programs to raise. Juniper Sussman absolutely talks about this, that each of us individually, and even RID talks about interpreters. You know, these are things we have to think about. Regardless of the scheduler, regardless of any management, the individual interpreter needs to consider certain things before they get to any assignment. There are certain questions we need to ask ourselves. But that's not always what's taught in interpreter training programs. That has to be. That has to be part of the conversation. So you share your story, and I share my story, but it has to become more formalized that this is part of the curriculum.
I was told by the scheduler that often the emergency room situations that they would send interpreters to would be just somebody with a cold. But how am I ever to know what I'm walking into?
And we laugh about it, but this is happening often. You're right.
Pam, thank you so much. And I have so much appreciated learning from you and your journey. I also wanted to acknowledge myself as a certified interpreter. I am often working part-time, and I feel that the agencies don't know my skill. And I often rely on deaf people asking me to interpret, or other interpreters calling me because they know my skill set, and they'll ask for me. Often we get emails daily from an agency, and we don't even know who these agencies are. They might have just found our name on the RID list and are asking us to fill a job. So I've learned so much from your research, experience, and your study that helped me to mature in my own decision makings, and I look forward to further conversations. And for all others like me who often think, should I accept these jobs through the big business agencies of interpreting?
So you're talking about the value of getting requests to the community as opposed to being these larger systems. And again, not saying that that in and of itself is bad, but there's something to take note of. So when we're getting requests from particular deaf people, there's such a value. We all look to that as being valuable. So yes. And again, I want to go back and mention RID. They have created, obviously, directories with all of us. And now, that's often being used as if that's a vetted list, that everyone on that has a certain amount of skills. So if someone's out of state or isn't really in the business, see these names, and yet these names have students. They have various people, but they're going to these lists to then request interpreters for jobs. And there are people who accept from these types of requests. So that is happening out there. It's kind of scary.
You're right, it is so important. And so thank you so much for your experience over the 25 years. All right, I'm going to move my notes up here because I forget things easily. Really, this is rich research, and I'm so thrilled for you. I have to look at my notes because there's so much. I think you're right. There are many people here because this is such an important topic. I feel like this is a can of worms that you've opened. I feel we did it. We've all known that the can was
Right.
sitting there.
They're out. They're
But the
crawling
worms-
all over the place.
But the can is open. And often we peek at the can of worms, but we really don't want to open up that can. We want to keep it
And
closed.
I want us to keep looking at it.
No, I have to say, I like the worms. I'm not afraid of them. And so let's open up that can of worms. I think who owns interpreting is really behind a lot of the research that you do. Interpreters say that they own interpreting. Does the community own interpreting? Do agencies own interpreting? Where does interpreting belong? Does it belong in the free market? Does it belong under government regulations? So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Now I know that there's no right or wrong answer and no one way to solve this problem. But how do we take back the power? That the community can take back that power? How do we as interpreters take back the decision-making power? Is that through licensure? Is it licensing agencies, licensing schedulers? How is it that the community and the interpreters take back the power?
Sure, and that's something that's being discussed more and more now about licensure. And I think it's a reaction. I think we're jumping to that before a lot of this understanding and really looking at what's going on. So right at this point, we don't have a let's do this or let's not. We really need to continue to look and to explore more what's happening. Of course, we want to decide. Of course, we know that access is so important. That's ultimately the goal. But even at this point, interpreters can say, regardless of how they're getting assigned, no, I'm not the appropriate person for this job. But you're asking who owns this. And so I want to go back and looking at the stakeholders and including schedulers as part of the stakeholders. That's where the discussion has to be. All of us own it. And so decisions are not made from some business entity for economic reasons. That's not where the decisions ultimately are made. They really have to be made getting the stakeholders involved. Obviously, management and businesses are part of the conversation, but they're not the ultimate decision maker without engaging those stakeholders. It's a complex.
But they have been.
They have been, and that's where some of the changes come from. And it's really just created more and more of a complex phenomenon. And we have to unpack it and look at it together. Not easy, but what I'm recommending we have to do.
Thank you for your wonderful research. And your research will light the fire to start people thinking about this conversation.
And people have been thinking about this. I'm not saying it's something new. There have been a lot of thoughts and feelings about it, but it's beginning to academically, through research, look at it in a different layer as opposed to just sharing stories and opinions about it. Really academically trying to see what are we actually looking at? Instead of just complaining, instead of, quitting and moving on, let's take a deeper dive and look at it.
I look forward to more from your dissertation defense and ideas about how to frame this. To not just think about it, but to actually engage in the doing of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. First, want to just say that I'm here in support of my sister, Pam.
And you've been with me for so many years. Yes.
Also, this is a wonderful topic. I'm a federal staff. I want to talk about this from a federal staff perspective. Often, there are so many interpreting agencies that have their way of doing things, but at federal agencies, we often feel stuck because of the roles that we're in. For example, managers, contractors, interpreters. I rely on an interpreter. Often, as an interpreter scheduler, I need to find an interpreter for this job now. Sometimes I take the scheduling role. And then as an interpreter, sometimes I know that I'm not the best fit. And so often we are disconnected from the community because we're situated in a particular federal office. We feel lost because of those mandates, and this workshop was perfect to unpack that. And it's time to get to the what do we do about it?
So that takes me right back to the vacuum cleaner. How does that vacuum cleaner work, right? if you got rid of certain parts, it's not going to suck up the dirt anymore, right? It needs all of those parts to get it to work with integrity. And that's what I'm talking about, the parts of scheduling are all these different stakeholders. It's not going to work. You take one thing away, it's not going to suck up the dirt. So we have to get everyone involved.
The system has failed. I would love to see more of that discussion among federal workers so that we can institute policies that guide us to actions. What can we do?
We just talk about you as the agency, right? What about the interpreters? You know, how are decisions being made? Like I said, ordering cup and pen, often going with the cheapest bid, right? Well, what about interpreting? All agencies following that don't work. There's other parts that are involved.
Right, and I think that that's something for further discussion, that not all interpreters are created equal. I don't actually have a question. I just came to get a hug from Pam.
She's out there getting me to exercise all the time. She is a rock in my life. I'm not going to say any more.
Any additional questions? I have to say that you have been the best audience we've ever had.
And Falami, looking at you.
No. We often think of scheduling as having a minimal role, but who knew that this topic of scheduling would draw so much excitement and emotion? Thank you for your analysis, for unpacking the process of scheduling interpreters. Really a thank you from all of us. There's one more comment, so let me invite that person to the front. Actually, two more. I am taller now.
You have beautiful shoes.
I know. It happens when you're 6 feet tall. I will also disclose that I work in the federal government. And I had to arrive late because of my interpreting schedule. But luckily, I was just told that I will be able to watch your presentation later because it's going to be archived. And also, I can catch up on some of the historical Colloquium presentations. So anybody who missed the beginning of this presentation, know that you can catch up as well. My comments are more broad as a person who schedules interpreters and all of the layers that go into that. It's a difficult task. And often people don't respect us as professionals. For me specifically, most people who meet me think that I'm young, that I don't know what I'm doing. And I am constantly trying to fight for what I know is right. And like you just said, most of the decision makers have no idea what they're doing. Often I have to defend my decisions, and I'm told that that's not how we do it here. How do you respond to that conundrum?
First, by understanding that you're really within all of this complexity. So there's experience being brought in from every different stakeholder group. And some of it might impact negatively, right? But it's experiences that we all have. And not to look at it personally, even though it feels like it. But we're all caught up with this in the whole system. So looking at what your experience is as a scheduler, and what is it that schedulers don't know about? I mean, you saw one comment there that one scheduler even said, CPC, that doesn't relate to me. That came from a scheduler. Where does that thought come from? Maybe there are formulas or way to work this all out, but that was a view of scheduling. So to look within scheduling and continue to talk about this, inviting in others, and don't tell people what it is that they need to do, but have these conversations together. Not as if you do this or you do that, and separating out, but get people to have conversations about all this. What impact will this have? Why are you doing that? There's research we can read about this, and bring it all in. invite the stakeholders to engage together. That's not always possible, but do that as much as you can. I think that will start.
Thank you. All of this feedback helps me plan for the future. And my next comment is that I'm so thankful to see you here presenting, starting this discussion, defending your dissertation. It means so much to me personally as an interpreter of color, as a friend, with you as my mentor, as all of the things, as all of the above.
And she's the current president of Niobe, DC. I want to introduce her to the crowd here.
I mean, that too. But that I am able to still be in contact with you, that we're not out of touch with Flami, Kathy, Tiffany, Candace, that we're all able to reach out and have this conversation together, and that community means the world to me.
And that's our village.
We don't want to lose those connections. And so we all need to be engaged as much as possible with the deaf community and with interpreting.
So I do want to mention something. We have created this village and we're often together, but we have to reach out and connect with all of the other stakeholders. That's on us as well. And you know that. So I'm not going to say more.
I digress. But again, thank you so much. Love you big time. Right. Final comment. Thank you. Yeah, I knew I was coming here, so I couldn't bring the baby with me. Now, over my lifetime, I've been involved in several different things. Now, my wife is an educator, and you mentioned education. I wouldn't think necessarily about that topic as part of the stakeholder for this. So, how do you envision pulling in educators? Now, we know that these changes can't be made overnight. Now, often, educational interpreters, how do we engage educational interpreters who are, my wife is a K through 12 interpreter, and so how do we engage K through 12 interpreters? Often, they're not scheduled like university interpreters are.
It's almost as if it's been there for so long that we kind of forget about it, and you're bringing it right back and saying we can't forget about it. So in those conversations, we have to think about what is the scheduling process. It involves the training, the educating of interpreters, getting people involved. They're not admin, and that's sometimes how we look at it. I don't look at it that way. So your partner, your wife, and I'm not sure the exact context, but figuring out how to include people from education in the conversation. So the scheduling of interpreters, consumers, deaf consumers. Obviously, we're talking about access. Everything really is all within that. We need to involve them in the conversation. I don't have the answer at this point. I'm still in the exploration of all this. I'm still bringing it to light, seeing what's emerging. Sometimes concerned with what I'm seeing, sometimes not, but I'm still in that process, and we have to just continue that.
Thank you. This is amazing. And when we have interpreters, schedulers, students, I feel like I'm always a student because I'm constantly learning. So I want to thank you for this
Me too.
class that you've given me today. All right, I know that we could go on, but we are coming to the close of our time. And thank you again. I think that shows it's so important, and that, wow, Pam, that you can discuss these worms, if you will, this dicey subject with compassion and grace. Before I close again, I wanted to invite everyone to the cafeteria. Please join us for a reception in honor of Pamela. I want to also invite you to next year's colloquium. We will have 4 additional presenters next year. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Pam, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, everyone.